First, I'd like to welcome all of the viewers out there across the globe. My name is Mitch Messer. I am a Senior Asset Manager with Home Pride Properties. And joining me on the call as my co-host is Marta Brown, who's Principal Broker with Blue Peach Realty. You doing okay, Marta?
I'm great. Good morning, all.
Awesome. We have a lot of stuff to cover, so I'm going to dive into it. I will just briefly say that this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart and to Marta's heart. Between the two of us, we have done dozens of owner finance deals over a couple of decades and are excited to be here to talk about this topic and particularly to field your questions about it. There is a little bit of housekeeping I do want to get out of the way up front. First is that once we're done with this, assuming that I didn't fumble some of the technical details, we are recording and a link to the recording will be made available once we're done and once it's been rendered. So by all means, take great notes, but don't fret if you don't capture everything because you will get access to the presentation after it's done. I would ask that you hold your questions till the end. We're going to answer questions at the very end, and then we're going to ride out the remainder of the hour addressing those questions. But please do make a note of them so that you'll remember what they are. The chat feature should allow you to send us your questions. I'll ask if you are here now, if you do me a favor and just use that chat box to tell me where in the world you are right now, what country you are in, just so that I can get a sense of who's out there and make sure that you actually can hear me. Okay, I see people coming in. We've got a Singapore. I'm pretty sure somewhere in here is a Namibia. It may take a little longer to type all that. Savannah, Georgia, no worries there. Okay, excellent. So that's coming in. So at least I can confirm that I am being heard and that we can be heard. I will acknowledge up front that the photos that you'll see are mostly from NASA. Mostly because I think they're gorgeous photos and I happen to be an enormous geek / nerd. So that's why you're seeing, pretty sure this is Buzz Aldrin on the surface of the moon. So just forgive me my nerdiness, but that's why they're there. And I think they're beautiful. All right, so let's get started. The purpose of this presentation is to introduce owner financing as a topic. It is a huge topic, and I will admit up front, I'll acknowledge that there is no way that we can cover in an hour every aspect of owner financing. It is a topic that could easily take an entire weekend seminar, but I do want to at least achieve one goal, and that is by the end of this presentation, you will be able to assess an owner finance deal, which is to say you'll know what questions to ask someone who claims that they've got an owner finance deal so that you can start figuring out if that deal makes sense. And so if by the time I'm done, everybody on the call can do that, I will be happy. I will upfront state that owner financing is relevant for any investor here in the United States, but it's particularly relevant for international investors, largely because there are so few options for international investors looking to buy with financing here in the States. All the great programs that we've got here as citizens, VA and FHA, et cetera, aren't available, obviously, to folks who aren't citizens. And so you're left with marginal bank financing, which typically requires, in some cases, up to 30% down and horrible interest rates, or hard money, which is in some cases just as bad. So the fact that owner financing exists is something that I really want to dive into because I think it can have particular relevance for folks who aren't accustomed to it and who want to use it as an alternative to bank financing or hard money loans. But I do want to kind of describe in some fast detail, the road from start to finish that we're only going to start a few steps down today. We are going to define owner financing. We are going to discuss those elements of an owner finance deal, and we will discuss evaluation of an owner finance deal. And we'll get all those things done today. What we will not cover, what will be covered perhaps in some later sessions down the road, are how to negotiate an owner finance deal. How do you approach a seller to begin the negotiation for an owner finance deal? We won't talk about how to structure, the various ways that an owner finance deal can be structured. We won't cover how to close an owner finance deal. What does a closing attorney have to do with an owner financed transaction that they wouldn't have to do with a bank financing transaction? We won't talk at all about taxation. We won't discuss any tax-related issues. And we also won't dive into special cases, things like subject to. Some of you have heard of that term. The use of notes. We won't discuss any of that. Again, these are all potential topics for a future date. And we also won't discuss what I call disaster recovery, what happens when things go wrong, which is obviously important and a topic in itself. We could spend an hour just talking about that, and then at some point we will, but you can't get there until you start here. So these are just some of the things that we will ideally cover at some point in the future, but for today, we're just going to try to get those first three things done. Marta, any comments on this slide?
No, I'm good to go. It sounds like a really robust list, and it does take a little more time to really absorb all of the elements of owner financing. It's different than your typical transaction, therefore may take a little bit longer.
Yeah, and I'm fine with us laying the groundwork now, and then as we get to these other topics, we won't do all this background work. We'll just jump right into it when we talk about items 4 through 9, for example. And I think for the record, this happens to be some sort of a shuttle takeoff. But again, I just thought it was kind of cool. So let's talk about a pretty basic definition of owner finance. It's any purchase transaction where the seller is willing to accept other than all their cash upfront. That's pretty much it. It's pretty straightforward. That's how I define owner financing. That said, I think it is important to discuss what I have learned in the last year or so are the three elephants in the room when one brings up owner financing. And I'll admit that I wasn't aware that these existed until fairly recently. But I do want to discuss them because there's no point in me talking to you about the virtues of owner financing if in the back of your mind you're sitting out there in webinar land thinking, yeah, but. So let's address the yeah buts. The first is nobody that I know has ever done this. That objection, the unfamiliarity, or no one's doing this and therefore there's got to be something wrong with it. That I guess is I can understand that objection, that concern, but I'll just say that hardly anyone's doing it because most people don't receive the training necessary to do it right. And that could be said about a lot of topics that are extremely powerful and effective that quote unquote hardly anyone is doing. So I don't want you to get hung up if you don't know one who's ever done an owner finance transaction. You can take it from myself and from Marta that we have done a number of owner finance transactions. So at least now you know somebody, and you know two people who have done owner finance transactions. We're going to talk more about how they work, but I don't want you thinking that because no one in your circle is doing it, that it's something that's not worth doing. It absolutely is worth doing. And we'll talk about that more in a bit. Let's address the legality concern. Some people have actually said, well, isn't that illegal? Isn't that somehow, borderline illegal? And the answer is absolutely not. It's ironic to me that banks have us so convinced that the only way to do financing is through them. That's an amazing coup for them. But no, there's absolutely nothing illegal about owner financing as a concept. There are ways to do it that can get you in trouble, but that's true for anything. And so obviously you want to do it right and you want to close with an attorney and so forth. But it itself is not inherently illegal. There's nothing illegal about having the seller accept payments for their equity. And then finally, and this one really surprised me, but I was on an international post or group a couple of weeks ago, and there was an entire thread about this topic. Anytime you see owner financing, you've got to be extra careful, because nobody in their right mind would do an owner finance deal if there weren't something wrong with the deal or wrong with the house or wrong with the seller. That, why on earth would someone offer owner financing? I think the actual quote was, why would someone offer owner financing in Atlanta if houses are selling so quickly there? And I thought to myself, that's hilarious, because there are any number of reasons why sellers in this market, in the market that we have right now in Atlanta, would consider owner financing, even though it's quote unquote as hot as it is. And I'll just address a couple of those reasons briefly right now, and then we can talk about that more in the Q&A. The first is, in some cases, sellers just want speed. They just want someone who can close this thing fast. And the beauty of owner finance transactions is that they can close very quickly. Bank loans take at least a month or so. And if you, as a seller, don't want to wait a month and you want to get this thing done and move on with your life, then there are very few transactions that are faster than owner finance. Now, you may say, well, cash is faster. Well, cash is about as fast, but for a variety of reasons we'll talk about later, there are ways that you can actually offer more money with financing than with cash. But let's at least all agree that a fast transaction for some sellers is all they really want, or primarily what they want. And so one obvious reason why someone might accept an owner finance transaction rather than wait for you to get bank financing is they want speed. The other is that there are lots of sellers out there who would prefer to get payments over time as opposed to getting a lump sum. I know this may sound odd to a lot of folks, but if you, for example, are a landlord and you've been accustomed to getting rent from a tenant over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, you may be perfectly fine with selling that property with owner financing and structuring it so that you get the exact same amount that you were getting as a rental now as an owner finance payment. The big difference being that you don't have to deal with tenants and toilets any longer. So there are a variety, these are just two, but there are a variety of reasons why a seller might prefer to get payments over time rather than getting an entire lump sum upfront. Marta, any comments about this one?
Yes, yes. I was thinking about a couple that may be important to investors who may be questioning owner financing. One, when you talked about faster transactions, let me give you some examples. People who are going through significant emotional events in their lives want fast. If it's a divorce, oftentimes they want fast, they want out, they want to have closure. If it were a parent, for example, and you've got the issue of selling their home, you want to bring closure as quickly as possible. If you're relocating, if your company has taken you out of your environment and you got to move on and they're not paying for the relocation costs, then you want fast, because you don't want to have to pay two notes in 2 places. So fast is one of those issues. Another is, I'm a licensed real estate broker, and let's face it, there are owners out there who don't want to pay commissions. And so having an owner finance deal is another way of avoiding paying commissions or paying that cost. So it can be attractive to owners in different ways, but I just thought I'd throw out those two.
No, that's a really great point. And speaking to the agent connection, it's also the case that some sellers, and frankly, I happen to be selling my house right now, and I'm one of these sellers, don't want a parade of people traipsing through their house bringing buyers. They just want to be able to get this thing done as fast as possible. And so speed is paramount, and avoiding all of the issues relating to listing a property, which would normally be good things, right? You'd want lots and lots of buyers coming to your property and looking at it and making an offer, except when you don't want any of that. When you just want to sell it and move on and not have to have the issues of folks trampling through your house. So yeah, those are excellent points, Marta. And these are all reasons why again, not to suggest that owner financing makes things better. There's certainly bad deals that could have owner financing structured for them. Owner financing is not inherently good or bad. It's just a tool that you should consider, but you shouldn't discard it because, quote, no one does that unless there's something wrong with the deal, because there are plenty of deals out there that are smoking hot deals that are owner financed. So let's move on to the next slide. I can do that. There we go. So let's talk about the elements of any finance deal, and I'll run through these in a decent pace so we can talk about the distinction between owner finance and bank deals. Any finance deal is going to have an issue of how do I apply for it? How do I get approved for this financing? What are the steps that have to be taken so that I can receive the financing? Many cases, there are some costs involved in applying for the financing that typically go to things like employment verification and credit checks, but there's usually a cost. There's usually some sort of independent assessment of value that takes place, and someone's got to pay for that. Obviously, purchase price is an element of a deal. Interest rate, these are the kind of the standard ones. Finance points are the expense that the person offering financing will extract from the person receiving financing as basically just additional profit, right? Where a single point is 1% of the purchase price. The rate at which the debt will amortize is another factor. The standard here in the US is 30-year amortization, but there's no rule that says it has to be 30-year. There's no law that says you can't get a 40-year or you can't structure a 20-year or 15-year or whatever you want year amortization. It's just that the standard is 30. The term could be until paid. It could be 10 years with a balloon at the end. But again, that's an element of the deal. Many deals are structured such that if you pay early, you have to pay a penalty, which we'll talk about that a little later, but that is a pretty standard component in lots of finance deals. And this one is a huge one. And it is the fact that when you typically get financing, the lender wants to be protected, and the lender will protect themselves first and foremost by using the property as collateral. So if you get a bank loan and you default on it, the bank will foreclose and take the property back and attempt to sell it. However, if they sell it and the amount that they get for it is less than what you owed, in any case with a bank loan, the bank, because of the papers that you signed when you got the loan, has the ability to go after your personal assets until they're made whole. And that ability for the lender to go after you personally to get what they need to make themselves whole is a huge part of bank financing that we'll talk about later, not so much with owner financing. And then finally, who holds escrow, whether escrow is held at all, escrow being the required payments that the lender wants to extract to make sure that their interests are protected, typically taxes and insurance, whether or not that gets held and by whom are other elements of a finance deal. So these are, and there may be others, but these are the big, if you will, 11 components of any finance deal. Marta, any comments on this?
No, it sounds pretty robust, Mitch. I think you've included most of those important elements. But if you look at this list and you think, when you go and have bank financing, you think about that several inches of paper, this is why. Because there's so many of those kinds of elements that have to be documented for a lender to want to move forward. Right, and most of these are intended to in favor of the bank. Absolutely. In contrast, absolutely. Let's talk about owner financing. So if these are elements, these 11 elements are potentially present in any finance deal, and that is true, it is also true that with owner financing, everything is negotiable. And more importantly, the
quote unquote lender is the owner themselves. And so as long as you and the seller are on the same page, there's no need for approval criteria. They're not typically going to require that you give them your credit report or verify your income. They might, but they typically aren't thinking about that. They're not making you pay application costs. They're not typically looking at an appraisal. They might, but generally speaking, they're not. And the reason for all of those not being the case is because they are intimately familiar with the asset because it's their house. Unlike a bank that's making a loan on a property that they don't currently own, in this case, the owner that's financing your transaction knows the property and is intimately familiar with it, and in most cases will tell you what they think it's worth. So there's not a whole lot of need for an appraisal with an owner finance transaction. We hardly ever do an appraisal for an owner finance transaction because there's no need for one. Yes, you have purchase price, interest rate, points potentially, as you would with a regular bank financing, but they are negotiable because the person who's asking for these things isn't necessarily trying to make a profit. They're not in the business of lending money. They've got a house that they're trying to sell. So the interest rate is going to be a factor, but it's going to be generally far less than what a bank is going to charge you. Most individuals selling their house aren't even thinking about points, so you usually won't have to pay those, although you might pay one of those. Amortization, we'll talk a little bit about later, but that again is entirely negotiable. You will not get a bank in the US to vary from their standard 15 or 30 standard, but with an individual, you could structure whatever makes sense for them. Term, same thing. You could arrange for a 10-year term with a balloon, or 20 years, or as long as you can get. And as long as the seller nods their head up and down and says it's okay, you've got a deal. No owner is charging you prepayment penalties. No owner is going to chase after you personally. They could, but they're typically not going to. They're just going to want to get their house back because that's pretty much what they've got into this. So the fact that those 5 and potentially others could go away entirely or be very, very much negotiable makes owner financing a huge deal, a huge benefit over bank financing. And we'll talk about this more in detail. Just before I forget, escrow, same thing. As long as payments are being made, you can probably negotiate how much escrow the seller is going to need to be comfortable. And in most cases, you're going to want that paid in escrow yourself. But the aha for me for this, the takeaway for this slide is some things just go away off the bat when you're owner financing because your typical owner is not going to bring these up as issues. And if you're structuring the financing, you're not going to make yourself pay a prepayment penalty. So there's no need to even broach that subject. Marta, any comments on this one?
Just one comment. With the multiple listing services that most agents use to buy and sell houses or to help their clients, you have no idea the number of times when I've had a listing where an agent has asked me, will the owner be willing to owner finance the property? It's a very attractive way of financing a property from a buyer standpoint as well, because you don't have to go through the same approval process. There are people out there who have money, but they can't not qualify for a standard bank finance. So there are other sides to owner financing that you may not be aware of, but they are extremely attractive and sought after by a lot of people here in the States.
Yeah, excellent point. And we should probably point out that we have both, you and I have both bought with owner financing and sold with owner financing. In fact, I sell quite a bit through HomePride with owner financing. And the reason why we do that, people ask all the time, why do you guys do that? It's because it brings people out of the woodwork looking to grab our deals, because there are so few deals on the market that do offer financing that an owner finance deal gets snapped up if it's a halfway decent deal. Now, that doesn't suggest that there can't be an owner finance deal that's not attractive. If the terms aren't attractive, if the numbers don't work, owner financing won't save you, but it certainly can make a great deal awesome or a good deal great. And when you're trying to sell a deal, it widens the applicant pool, because people who couldn't qualify for bank financing can all of a sudden qualify for owner financing. We had a house that we worked on about 4 or 5 years ago, beautiful house. The person who ended up getting the house couldn't qualify. They had tons of cash, but they couldn't qualify for a loan. And there's tons of reasons why people, especially today, can't qualify for bank financing. But they are perfectly good risks, if you will, candidates for living in a house. They can make the payment. They want to be a homeowner. They just can't get bank financing. And so if you can, through owner financing, allow folks like that into your house, you can, in some cases, charge a premium for those deals, because people who can't otherwise qualify can qualify through you. So yeah, I agree with you, Marta. It's a huge benefit if you can offer it. So let's talk about real numbers, because I think that will bring all of this to a finer point. Let's talk about a cash transaction. $100,000 house, which here in Atlanta is going to get you a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, pretty decent sized house, maybe a little bit, maybe 3-1. Let's assume that it's a cash transaction, so there's no down payment. The rent is $1,000 a month. Let's call the expenses $4,000 a year. And if you do the math for net operating income, you get $8,000, 12 of income minus the 4 of expenses. And if you bought that property cash, you'd get an 8% cash on cash return, which is not horrible. It's below what I'd probably want to be excited about, but that at least everybody understands cash. No problem. Let's talk about what that looks like with a traditional bank loan. Same $100,000 price. The standard for, I'm actually being generous here. I'm only suggesting that it's going to be a 20% down payment for a non-owner occupant or investor financing. So the kind of financing that an international investor is going to be able to get on a property like this, if they can get financing from a bank at all, is going to be 20, 25, 30% down. So let's just assume that it's only 20% down, $20,000, same rent, same expenses. And let's say the interest rate is a reasonable 6%, which is probably low, but okay, I had to pick something, so I picked 6. The debt service on that ends up being $480 a month, 30-year amortization, and let's assume the loan fees are about $2,000. Now your net operating income drops significantly from $8,000 cash to $2,240 with the bank loan. But of course, since you're only putting up $20,000 plus the $2K in loan fees, your investment is far lower. So now we've got a pretty decent cash on cash return, 10%, give or take. Not bad. Most people would look at that deal and say it's worth looking into, not horrible. However, let's talk about owner finance. Same $100,000. The down payment, I'm putting $10,000 here, but of course it's whatever you can negotiate with the seller. If the seller doesn't need all their money up front, then you may be able to go lower than $10,000. So the aha here, the takeaway here is not that you're always going to be able to get a down payment of 10%. It's just that it's only what the seller needs that will dictate what your down payment is. So some sellers may need more, in which case you'll have to pay more. But if the seller only needs $10,000 in cash up front, then that's all you need to pay to get into the deal. And we've had many deals where the seller took next to nothing down. They just wanted to get that monthly payment. We'll talk in a minute about the numbers, but let's just assume that the rent obviously is the same, expenses are the same. Let's assume the same 6% interest rate. Right now, 30-year fixed rates are about 4 to 5. So frankly, if I were doing this with an individual, I wouldn't start at 6. I would probably propose more like 4 to 5. And we'll talk in a minute about an alternative to all that. But let's just say 6 because it makes the math easy. That means the debt service for this is exactly the same as it was for the bank loan, $480 a month. But there are no loan fees, right? I'm not going to, let's assume I'm not paying points. I'm not paying any special upfront fees to get this loan because most owners are not going to ask for it. So the net operating income is still the same as it was before. My income hasn't changed, but my investment is now only 10,000 bucks, which means my cash on cash return is 22%. And the takeaway from this is not that, wow, you can get 22%. It's that, well, that is one takeaway, that obviously that you can get a much higher return by paying less down. But the other takeaway that I wanted to point out is that another consequence of this higher cash on cash return is that if I set this up as a spreadsheet, because obviously all of these numbers are related, if I increase the price to 110,000, then that means more down payment because it's a percentage, et cetera. But if I were to do the math and play with the numbers, I could get that cash on cash return down to something that I am comfortable with. And what I would find is that that allows me to offer more, to pay a higher price, quote unquote price, to that seller. So the consequence of owner financing is that for that exact same deal, I can get my 11% cash on cash return and offer that seller maybe 110, 120, I haven't done the math, but a higher price that still works for them, that makes me more competitive than someone who's just offering 100,000 cash or 100,000 with the bank loan. So we often get deals, we often grab deals away from other investors who only have cash in their pocket or a bank loan in their pocket, because if we structure an owner finance deal with the seller, we can pay them more in many cases and still get a decent return. And that, I think, is the point of all of this. It's just math, right? I mean, there's no magic here. Once you've opened up the seller to the possibility that they can receive payments over time and they nod their heads up and down that sounds appealing, then it's just a math problem. It's just a question of what number works for them and works for you. And in many cases, you'll find that the seller doesn't need $20,000 down. They're happy with 10 or less. And then if you run your numbers, you can get a decent return and still pay them slightly more than they were going to get from other people. And so as a competitive tool, it means I, with owner financing as a club in my golf bag, can get deals that people who just have cash can't, because they're capped out at 100, and I can raise that price to over 100. Now, I'm putting air quotes around that 100 because yes, I'm going to pay them 100, but I'm paying it over time. And so the beauty, obviously, of the time value of money is I'm not forking out $100,000 up front like that cash person is. So I can pay more, and oftentimes we do. So I want to let these sink in because to me, this is the payoff for owner financing. When people say, oh, I don't want to do owner financing, or I don't want to consider owner financing, I scratch my head and wonder, because that's just like saying I don't like multiplication or I don't like division. It's just a tool. It's just math. It's not going to jump up and bite you. If you work out the numbers and owner finance doesn't make it work for you, then you don't have to offer it. If the seller says, under no circumstance will I accept anything less than full asking price in cash at closing, then owner finance is an option for them. But asking the question and approaching it in a way that provides room for that owner to say, you know what, I don't really need the whole thing up front. And in fact, there may be some reasons why I don't want the whole thing up front. Maybe it'd be better off for me if I took it in over time in payments. Then everybody wins. We're not twisting anyone's arm to force them to accept owner financing. If the seller doesn't want to do it, you can't make them do it. But if you don't ask the question, no seller off the bat is going to suggest owner financing. Owner finance deals are almost always, unless you're dealing with a professional, almost always created when you're dealing with what I'd call a civilian, just a regular homeowner. And so a simple question, hey, do you really need all your cash up front? What are you going to do with the money once we sell this thing? Or once we buy this thing from you? Are you going to use it all to buy another house, or are you going to just go to Florida and retire? If they're going to Florida and retire and they've already picked out their house and don't need this money to buy their next house, then perhaps owner financing is an option. But you'll never know if you don't ask. And if you're afraid, or if you think that it's somehow sketchy, then you're missing out on a huge, huge opportunity. One last thing I'll say, and then Marta, I will pause for a breath. I'll let you jump in. We have had scenarios, I mean, this is not hearsay. We have done deals where the owner has taken nothing down and just accepted payments. We've had deals where the owner paid us to take the house off their hands. That's how badly they wanted to get it sold. So when people say that those kinds of things aren't possible, I smile because I've seen them. It's not something that someone told me about. I've actually experienced that. And there's one last transaction that I want to discuss, because this one has blown my mind every time I talk about it. often it's the case that it's a $100,000 house and you make the offer to the seller, hey, how about if I pay you $10,000 down and pay you $500 a month until paid? That sounds like a pretty good deal. $500 a month, payments applied towards principal until it's paid in full, whatever that ends up working out to be. I'll pay you $500 a month until the $90,000 balance is zero. If that seller nods their head up and down and says, that sounds like a pretty good deal, $500 a month, what you have just done, and I know Marta knows where I'm going with this, what you've just done is gotten 0% financing on that deal. You're paying no interest whatsoever. Every bit of that $500 is going to reduce your principal. And if the seller is okay with that, then you have achieved the holy grail of finance. And we have done that, is my point, is that it's been the case that seller goes, yeah, that sounds about right, $500 till paid, cool, deal. That's like unicorns flying out of the sky and landing on your lawn with a pot of gold in their teeth. That's pretty darn good. And in situations like that, you take those deals and you run with them. But again, that will never happen unless you ask for it. And you can't ask for it if you think that there's something sketchy or underhanded or illegal about owner finance. So you now, well, let me pause and see, Marta, if you have any comments about anything that I've said or anything that I've covered so far.
Well, this was a very robust case study, Mitch. And I certainly hope with the comparing apples to apples that individuals on the call got it. That, looking at the comparison of the three possible case studies that are here, be it cash, bank loan, or owner financing. One thing I wanted to throw out, sometimes owners want to be the bank or they want to finance because they don't want to receive a lump sum payment. Maybe it's bad for from their tax standpoint, their tax position with the IRS here in the United States. So it's attractive to them not to accept or not to sell it the quote unquote standard way. So it makes it attractive for them. And we never know what their situation is until we have that conversation with them. So that's just one of those reasons why an owner may want to consider it. Yes, we have done deals where we have paid 0% financing. We give them $10,000, sometimes $5,000, sometimes $20,000, depending on the house, depending on the property, and depending on the terms that we negotiate with the owner. And then we say, well, I think in one case we had a house that it was only about $100,000 house, similar to this one. And we paid the seller $8,000, if my memory doesn't fail me. And we said, how about $500 a month? And the seller said, sure, because they wanted to receive additional income at that point in time. And we did not pay we did not pay any interest. The irony in that deal is that the owner turned around a few years later, where we're paying the $500 on a regular basis, and said, I want all of my cash. I want all of my cash in the next few weeks. So what we ended up doing is discounting the loan. So we actually got the house for less overall of the purchase price. We discounted it probably by 50%. So instead of paying ultimately $100,000 for this house with the down payment and the monthly payments, we paid more like a total of $50,000 for the house. The seller walked, and we had an asset that we could then have complete control over. So there are very unique advantages when you're looking at an owner finance deal. And I'll stop because I know we're running out of time, Mitch.
Hey, thanks, Marta. I was muted, and so I didn't.
That's okay.
I'm looking at the questions, and I'm looking at the time, and I'm realizing that we should probably open it up to questions. I do want to come back to this because Eric has made an observation that is absolutely right, and I stand in my shame and acknowledge that if the owner finance transaction has $10,000 down payment, the mortgage balance is $90,000, not $80,000 as before, so the debt service will be slightly higher. So my number 22% is slightly off. And so I hang my head in shame. I will probably try to fix this in the after the fact if I can. So if, and again, I'm not going to try to run the numbers now on the fly, but I think we can all agree that it will be higher than 10%. And we can make the suggestion that even my math error notwithstanding, when you have the ability to create your own rules, when you have the ability to structure the financing so that it serves the needs of the seller and the buyer and nobody else, then it's hard to go wrong. It's hard to have have a deal that everybody's not happy with. And so I think it's important for us to make that point. The other point that I want to make is some folks might hear the 0% and say, gosh, you're taking advantage of those folks. And I would just point out that we are simply suggesting a payment. If they say, hey, you know what? Hey, what about interest? Then, if we negotiate and offer 500 with no payments and they propose interest, then we would go ahead and work out an interest rate that works. And if they say they've got to have 15%, that might kill the deal, in which case we can't buy it from them. So it is always an interaction between buyer and seller. It's a dance like anything else. It's a negotiation, and it's whatever you end up with that ends up being what shows up on the documents that govern the financing. So no one is making anyone do anything, nor are we hiding anything. But if they'll accept 6%, there's no need for us to offer 7. I mean, we could. One could argue that, if we're willing to pay 7, that we should pay it. But, we're all capitalists here, I believe. And so our goal is to get it at the best terms for us that also work for the seller. So having said that, I know that there are some questions here. So Marta, I'm hoping you can see the questions that I can see in the Q&A. And so I'm going to start
Yes, I
tackling
can.
them. Eric, again, so Eric, thanks for your observation. And yes, I am ashamed, and I'll fix that. His question is owner financing kind of a fringe opportunity? I would say I don't think so. I think it's rare only because so few people want to deal with it. I think Marta will support me in this, and she is the exception to the rule. But most agents don't want to deal with this. So if it's a listed house and you want to propose that the seller consider financing, not a situation where the agent has already worked out with their seller that they want to offer financing. But if you approach an agent that's got a listed property and say to that agent, hey, will the owner finance? Most agents will say what, Marta?
Well, they will say, I'm not sure if I understand it. I'm not sure if it's legal. They don't allow it in my office. They're very uncomfortable, quite frankly, with the concept. And it's an education issue, I think. But they're very uncomfortable with the concept once you get outside of the norm, which is to list a house, you buy it for cash, or you buy it with bank financing. That's the comfort level of many agents out there. And I'm hoping that over time, more will become educated, but that's exactly what we run into.
So the same 3 elephants that exist for investors, sadly, exists for other people as well, including agents. And on top of that, you have the reality that for a lot of people, and this kind of surprised me. I mean, I know you're a math geek, if you forgive the phrasing of geekiness, by degree, and I'm an engineer by degree. Math, this is not particularly sophisticated math. It's pretty basic stuff. But there are lots of folks out there who are completely math phobic. And so when you start talking amortization and payments and interest rates, their eyes glaze over and they're just, cash. Just give me cash. I understand cash. And so for a lot of folks, a lot of the intermediaries, the agents, the folks in the middle, the advisors, will say, oh, no, can't we just do cash? Cash is so much simpler and easier. And so they shut out the possibility of financing. And I've had investors say to me, what if I just pay you cash? when we were offering financing. And, my response is, sure, you can pay cash, but don't you want to run the numbers on both and see which one makes you more money? I'm not going to make you take the financing, but I can't imagine a world in which paying a big lump sum of cash is always better than at least looking at the financing. I'm not saying the financing is always going to be better, but if you don't run the numbers, there's no way for you to possibly know which is better. And so rejecting financing out of hand is just nuts, in my opinion, as an investor and also as a seller and so forth. So no, it's not fringe. It is uncommon because so few people understand it. But to my mind, that's where the opportunity lies, because if you approach a seller and ask the questions, and again, at some point down the road, I'm sure we'll have a webinar on how to broach the subject with a seller. But if you broach that subject properly and they don't do anything and they don't shut you down immediately, then at least the door is open to having a conversation about what might work for them. And as I've said repeatedly now, you can't make anyone take something that they don't want. But if you don't bring it up, it's never going to be discussed. And that's why it's uncommon, because so few people even bring it up. And it occurred to me that in some countries, they don't have owner financing. And so it would never occur to them that they should see if the seller is willing to accept something less than all cash up front. So it's not fringe. This is not intended to pitch home price properties, but for those of you who are on our list, you know that most of the deals that we offer are with owner financing. And that doesn't mean that they're great deals. I expect people to do their own homework and confirm for themselves if the deals make sense or not. But I can tell you that that we don't put deals out there that aren't, I'll speak humbly, as awesome as we can make them. And if the financing makes sense, then we encourage people to go ahead and grab it and make use of it. So yeah, the fact that it's not common is less about the fact that the deals are rare and more about most people just don't know how to ask for it, or they're afraid to ask for it, or they've been scared into asking it by other folks who heard about a guy who did it wrong and went to owner finance jail. Marta, any other comments you want to add on that topic? Marta? Huh. Hopefully I did not lose Marta. She might be muted. Something happened there. Let's move on to the other question. Does the owner financing have little or no equity? How about if repairs needed? The answer so the question is, does owner financing typically involve deals that have little or no equity? And what if repairs are needed? Is that negotiated or is handled by the buyer? It's all negotiable. We've done deals where the owner owned it free and clear. In other words, they had 100% equity. They owned the house with no debt whatsoever, and still were willing to do owner financing. So no, owner financing deals don't necessarily have to have little or no equity. We've done deals with lots of equity, with 100% equity. We've done deals with very little equity. Both are applicable. It just depends on what you can structure. Repairs, again, are a negotiated factor depending on the nature of the deal. Some cases the buyer does it, in some cases the seller does it. Usually in situations like this, the seller wants to do as little as possible. So handling repairs might be something that we would offer just to make the deal go down more easily for the seller. But again, that's not a component of the financing. That's just a component of the negotiation. Eric asks, if someone works out an owner finance deal, won't the broker involved in the deal be paid the same commission? The answer is, well, the answer is sorta, because, well, I guess the answer is yes. You'd think the agent would be pro-financing because it might save a deal, but it requires that they step way outside their comfort zone. And most agents are, in my opinion, like most bankers, are somewhat risk averse. And so if they don't understand it and they can't explain it to their client, to their seller, it's not going to be communicated in a way that makes the seller want to do it. And so, yeah, you'd think the agent would be on our side because the financing would make a deal that might not happen at all happen. But what you typically get are agents who will just hold out hope that a cash buyer will come along and save the day, rather than do this weird, or at least to them, weird owner financing thing. So it shouldn't matter, or it should, if anything, be a plus, another tool. But generally speaking, it's not, for the same reason why, you know, we're making this presentation today, because most people don't understand how it works and have been told or suspect that it's somehow fishy or dicey or dodgy, and so they don't want to touch that particular topic.
I'm sorry, Mitch, I got zapped off and I'm back on, but I did pick up some of the things that you were saying, and it is, understand, oftentimes agents are just looking at their total commission, and they're looking at the fastest and easiest way to earn that total commission. And that the fastest and easiest way, of course, is a cash deal. The next easiest, in their opinion, is a finance deal through a bank, because they're familiar with that approach. So there is a little hesitancy on their part to consider owner finance deals, because they want to know, where am I going to get paid, or how am I going to get paid? So just something to consider. And so oftentimes, unless you're working with someone who is very familiar with investor kinds of transactions, they won't know about that possibility. And that's where it's important to find an agent who does understand those possibilities.
Good point. And also, it's fair to note that whatever commission that the agent's going to get would need to be extracted from whatever down payment you've made to the seller. So in this case, if it's a 6% commission on a $100,000 house, of that $10,000 in cash that you're paying, that you're prepared to pay, the agent would get 6 of that, and the seller would get the remaining 4. And now you have this, they're basically fighting for the same piece. If it's a cash transaction, then, and it's a free and clear house, then yeah, the agent gets 6, but the seller gets the remaining 94. So it's a much different arrangement from the standpoint of the seller. So, and it rubs in the face, if you will, to the seller, the fact that this commission is not just funny money, but really coming out of their pocket. But to Marta's point, it is, and I'm not disparaging all agents. I'm simply describing the dynamic that often happens with agents that don't understand how financing works. If you get an agent like Marta, who understands intimately financing, then you are in much better position to sell your house if you're selling with financing, or to buy a house with financing with someone who understands how it works and also speaks agent. We are coming up to the 1 hour mark, and I do want to make sure that everybody has had a chance to ask their question. Eric has one last question about. So I had mentioned before his questions about whether they need to own their home 100%. Basically, can you do financing where there's debt on the property? And the answer is absolutely yes. It's beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's a topic for a future discussion, but absolutely. So we've done, both Marta and I have done transactions where the seller had very little equity or hardly any equity. And we can still structure owner financing. It requires some additional hoops to jump through, but it can be done. And again, it's not illegal, it's not immoral, it's not fattening. But yes, so the amount of equity that the seller has in the house is not a stumbling block to our ability to do owner financing. And we'll cover that in more detail down the road. I do want to do 2 quick things before we run out of time. I want to respect everyone's time and make sure that we end on time. I do want folks to, if they would, take a minute in the chat or in the Q&A and let us know if this was helpful. The reason why we do these at all is to help people understand how investing works to the extent that we can explain it in a forum that gives people an opportunity to ask questions. Anything is on the table. There's no hidden agenda. We're not attempting to sell product or service on this call. We are in the business, but that's not the purpose of this call. This call is entirely for the purpose of helping folks understand how these things work, so that, frankly, so that you can invest here if that's your goal. If an understanding of owner financing is standing in the way of someone doing a deal, then I want to address that concern because, you know, to me, this is magic, and it always has been. When I first learned about the fact that you could do this, my jaw was in my lap. And so the thought that somebody wouldn't pursue this because they've been told it's somehow under the table or underhanded or a suspect is tragic to me, because this is some of the most powerful stuff that you will ever see from a deal structuring standpoint. And certainly, Eric, we will be available to talk one-on-one. We just have to find a forum that works for you and for us. We've been so busy trying not to make people feel like we're pushing product that we've swung the pendulum a little bit too far in the other direction. But yeah, we will definitely reach out to you to have more detailed conversations about this in the context of actual deals, if you like, and make sure that all your questions are answered. And that's true for anyone else as well. I just want to take a quick peek at the chat. Awesome. Thank you so much. Cool. All right. Well, we appreciate everybody. Oh, someone's asking about, can you do owner financing in any state? You can. Marta, hoping you're still on. You can do it in any
Yes, I'm
state.
still here. Mm-hmm.
Some states are better than others. All states are not created equal. The reason why I'm a big fan of owner financing, particularly here in Georgia, is that Georgia is an easy state to fix your mistakes. So if you have to foreclose on someone who doesn't pay you on owner financing, in Georgia, you can do that in about 2 months, in some cases less. In California, it could take a year. In New York, it could take a year. So in those states, you can do owner financing, but if you run into a situation where the owner stops making, the buyer stops making payments, fixing your mistake can be troublesome. Not so in Georgia. Marta, any comments about that before we wrap up?
What we've done when we sell a property on owner financing, we also have a clause in our owner financing documents that if they stop paying, it reverts back to a lease, because we want to avoid any lengthy foreclosure processes. And that has worked for us, just to give you an idea.
Cool. And we have, oops, am I muted? No, I'm good. We didn't have time to talk about Dodd-Frank, et cetera. I mean, we could talk about this topic for hours and hours. But I hope that we did at least give you some appreciation for the topic. We'd like to come back to this topic at some point in the future. I would ask, for those of you who have a second before you go away, if you can let us know what you'd like some of our next topics that we might cover would include. I'll throw out there that one of the things that I am looking at, and actually Marta and I have both started looking at, is this whole vacation rental space. This whole notion of taking a property that might get $1,000 a month from a regular tenant and possibly setting it up for vacation rental and possibly doubling or tripling the amount of money that you can squeeze out of a property, which of course does great things for the cash on cash return. I don't know this topic. I'm actively seeking someone who's an expert on this to get them on a call like this so that Marta and I can pepper them with questions, and you, our invitees, can do the same thing. So if you have topics that you think you might be interested in, you can pop it into the chat or the Q&A, or you can send us emails after the fact. We will be reaching out to those of you who are on the call to get your feedback on that topic. And we intend to do this again in about a month. In the meantime, we are just at or about a minute away from 11 o'clock. I will thank you all for your attention. I know that some of you that are in other countries, other time zones, are staying up late or going to bed particularly early or are being available particularly early to be on this call. So thank you for being here to participate. Marta, any final comments before we say goodbye?
Just one quick comment. I certainly hope that what we've done is to intrigue you about the possibilities of owner financing. We certainly know that this one call has not been everything you can possibly know about owner financing. But again, we try to avoid hitting you with a fire hose of information. Well, we hope we have intrigued you to want to learn more and to become more proficient with the topic.
Awesome. All right, it is exactly 11 o'clock by my iPhone. So I will bid you all an excellent day or morning or evening, depending on where you are. And again, we'll make the link available with my little mistakes and all for all to hear from now until forever sometime soon. And we'll send that link out so that everybody has access to it. Thanks, everyone, for participating, and we will talk to you soon.